called the Mighty Creatives, where her role specifically is Director of Development. So she looks after income generation and fundraising for their charity. My name, for those of you who have joined since I did the first intro, my name is Marika. I work at Unlimited, work for our volunteering and pro bono team. And the webinar series is just one part of the work that we do, the support that we broker for the social entrepreneurs that Unlimited works with. So we work with mentors on a one-to-one basis, but also organize group sessions like this. So hopefully you will enjoy the webinar and find it valuable and useful. Unfortunately, you are not able to ask questions in person, as in you can't speak so that we could hear you. But the way you can interact with us, and we really hope that you do, is by asking questions. And if you look at the sort of dashboard that opened up when you registered and joined the webinar, there's a function that is called the chat. So any questions you have throughout, please just type them in through that chat function, and I will make a note of them at my end, and then we will most probably just deal with them at the end, but we will leave about 10 minutes at the end, and I will read them out to Caroline, who will then be able to answer your questions. So do use that function if you have anything you want to clarify or any questions you have. In terms of afterwards, so we have an hour for the webinar. You will get a copy of the slides. You will get a copy of the recording, so we are recording the webinar, so you can listen to it again if that is helpful. I think those are all the practicalities. I will now hand over to Caroline and say a big thank you in advance for her giving up her time to do this with us, and then I will speak to you at the end. Thanks. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Marika. I'm just checking to see whether or not you've actually done over the handover. I'm just looking to see if the chat facility is available. It's not coming up at the moment.
It's not coming up for you?
No, I can't see it at the moment, no.
It might mean that perhaps you can't do the chat. So what we will do is when people, I think that is one of the things about this software is that only myself as an organizer, I can only see the questions.
Okay, that's fine.
So if that's okay, I can then just read them out to you at the end.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You know, it was just more or less if we had any interactive activities, that was all. Yeah. So anyway, hello everybody, and thank you for joining in the webinar from Unlimited today. It's my delight to be here, and I hope that you find the following webinar useful. Basically, I'm going to be talking about income generation, funding and fundraising, sort of where to find it and how to get it. I'm quite a practical person, so there will be a number of things in the presentation which you would probably find useful afterwards, sort of like tools, web links and the like. So I think it's quite useful if you sort of stay for the presentation, then at the end you'll obviously be able to pick up a copy of it, and that will have the various links that I'll be referring to during my talk. So I just want to double check before we carry on that you can see the chat function to the right-hand side of the screen to send Marika any information or any questions that you might have. And also, in case I'm very loud or not very loud, perhaps you can adjust your volume control and or your headphone or speaker settings so that you can be in a comfortable sort of position, because obviously we're going to be here for a little while. So please do use the chat facility to ask questions or to leave comments, and then we will address those at the end. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, today we hope to cover, after the introduction, what are the types of funding and fundraising that are out there? Where to find it? Like, where would you go for it? How would you go about securing this form of income? How to get it, so how to be successful in those processes. And then at the end then we'll be picking up with questions and answers. So first of all, perhaps a little bit about me. Who am I? Well, my name is Caroline Kubin. I'm the Director of Development at a charity called the Mighty Creatives. We're based in Leicester, but we work across the region of East Midlands and indeed beyond. And part of what we do, or in fact all of what we do, relates to children and young people, and trying to improve and use their creativity and imagination to bring about new solutions, to tackle barriers in communities, and to create new opportunities for children and young people, and indeed their families and wider communities. Part of our work is with the 16 to 25-year-old sort of age bracket, where we focus heavily on community action and also young people who wish to set up their own social enterprises. So they are passionate, they have an idea, a business idea, but they don't really know where to go with it. Well, they will come to us and we will help support them through both through business development activities, through knowledge transfer, peer mentoring and mentoring generally, and also through an award system. So we are heavily involved in the social enterprise agenda here in the East Midlands. I'm also a trustee for a charity in the Birmingham area, and I have come from a background in the higher education sector, very much in the sort of the research, exploitation and commercialisation arena. I've been working now with Unlimited in this capacity for the last couple of years, and I've enjoyed it, and I hope it's of benefit to you today. I will make a slight apology up front to explain that a lot of my examples and some of the references will relate to the Midlands area. It's just simply because they are convenient for me and I'm familiar with them. You'll be in a different part of the country, so therefore you might have to do a little bit further digging to find out examples relevant to you or links. So hopefully if that's, that gives you an adequate explanation as to why we're all here, I'll carry on. So where are you now? I suspect that some of you may be in the process of setting up your own social enterprise, or may be involved in some early stage development, or maybe you are well progressed in your practice. But I think it's useful just to spend a few moments thinking about how you go about securing income, or how you're planning to secure income. And even if you've got a piece of paper and a pen to hand, just sort of jot down some thoughts. And I thought we'd maybe just have a couple of minutes just to reflect on where does income come from. And Morph is helping me here, having a little sort of contemplative moment thinking about, well, where are you now? Because obviously you're all in very individual sets of circumstances, and what's particular to you may not be relevant to other people. So where is the money coming from? And where do you want to be? Is that where you want to be in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? Do you think you could sustain that? Will it allow you to sustain that? And if you wanted to change, how would you get there? Here's just a couple of examples that I'm using from locally. Indigo Brave is based in the Nottingham area. It's a community enterprise and it's a learning and development organisation. They're a company limited by guarantee, but have very much a programme of activity linked into the Sherwood area of Nottingham. It's 100% traded income, so it's self-generated income. Whereas if we take a look at another example, Goodwill Solutions. Its legal structure is a community interest company, a CIC. It delivers affordable solutions to household and office furniture needs to charities and third sector organisations. It's located down in Northampton. Now once again, it started off with self-generated income, but more recently it's got involved with the Back to Work programme through apprenticeships. That's a government-sponsored programme. And more recently again then, it was involved in the acquisition of a new warehouse development. And as part of that purchase and mortgage and whatnot involved with that, the University of Northampton bought a 20% share. So that's kind of them buying into this process, and so that's sort of like an equity set of issues coming up. So those just got a couple of examples, but imagine if your company or your organisation was there, what would it say about you or where you intend to go? And I think that that's a useful way, because really what we're useful way to think about things, because that's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to think about how we develop and build sustainable organizations. So each of your business plans should have a clear sort of understanding, as with this red arrow, of income that can sustain and help you build your activities, that help you build your activities in such a way that you have a social impact, because that's the whole purpose of socially driven organizations, and that also you deal well with the ethical issues that arise from your trading activities and other activities. So let's move on now to what types of funding are available. Now the next slide looks quite complex initially, but actually it's very helpful and very useful, and I always keep it in mind when I'm thinking about strategy and how to go about raising funding. This is the income spectrum. Now, as I say, it initially looks quite daunting, but let's talk our way through it. If you look at the top, we've got the 4 keywords: donor, funder, purchaser, consumer. And really what they relate to is the proximity to the consumer. So if you think about it, the consumer at the right-hand end of the spectrum is obviously the consumer, so therefore it's very close. Whereas the further to the left you go, the more remote you become to the consumer. So for instance, if somebody was to donate money to your organization for whatever reason, that person may not know who's the ultimate beneficiary. So therefore the donor is far from the consumer. But equally in areas of education or of health, your consumer may not necessarily be your ultimate customer or your ultimate beneficiary. So for instance, in school settings, your ultimate beneficiary may be children and young people, but actually you may be selling your service to the school or to the other youth setting. And similarly in health, you may be selling your services into a hospital setting or into a healthcare setting. And so it's just useful to think about, well, who is actually paying? Where is that transaction, financial transaction, happening? So if you follow the arrows down from donor, funder, purchaser, consumer, we see different types of activity happening. So the 5 boxes, we've got the gift cycle, then further along then we've got agreed outputs. Further along again we've got to service level agreement, into structured market, and then ultimately into open market. And what they do is they reflect the 4 coloured boxes beneath them, sort of gift, grant, contract, and trading service. Now what we're going to be doing in the rest of this presentation is to look at each of these in turn to see how you go about funding, or how you go about generating income for each of these activities. So at the minute, I suspect a lot of you will be looking at trading service as your route to finance. But it may be that some of you are also thinking around contracts. You may even be thinking around grant and gift. And so it's important just to kind of be aware of what is out there and what might be appropriate or relevant to you. Ultimately, if you look at the very bottom, the arrows going in both directions, the spectrum is really going from the left-hand side, from asking for funding to do things, to the right-hand side of where you're earning funding to do things. And so everything lies in between. So let's return to these coloured boxes and just consider each in turn. The first one is the gift cycle. It's a range of headings that can come under this. Anything from public donation to major donor or corporate funding, through community and crowdfunding sources, even through to events and sponsorship. And we'll be looking at those a little bit more detail shortly. But basically the idea is that somebody donates funds to your organization for a specific purpose. And I'm sure we've all been involved in that in some way ourselves, in terms of giving to another organization. For some it is key, and obviously for a lot of charities that's a key way of working. But don't think that that maybe is not relevant to you if you're not running a charity. For instance, corporate events and sponsorship could be areas that you might be able to exploit in the future. The next box along is the grant box. This is where you get funding either from a private trust or a foundation or a corporate one or from a charity itself to help you achieve certain outcomes. And that's why in the box above we've got agreed outputs. So basically they will invest, usually on the basis of an application from you, to achieve a certain set of outcomes for the community or for the group of people that you might be working with. Now, for a lot of social enterprises, grant funding of this type is quite important, especially in the early days. And indeed, if some of you are Unlimited award winners, that's actually what you've got through that award. It's a grant. Now, if we move further along to the right, we come against contracts. Contracts are different from grants. Contracts specify a piece of work, and it's usually to quite a high degree of detail. But contracts, unlike grants, are legally binding. We're also seeing, I suppose, a proliferation of new forms of contract types as well. So for instance, what we have here, I've referenced service level agreements. We've also referenced to commissioning, where you might be commissioned to undertake a piece of work, through procurement, where you might apply through sort of open tendering for a piece of work. So it's much more where you react to a request, you submit your proposal, and then it's judged quite often on the basis of different criteria, but one of those criteria will relate to value for money. Contracts are legally binding, and therefore if you don't achieve the outcomes that you were contracted to achieve, there can be penalties. And I'm sure we're all aware of instances of where that has happened. So where basically there'll be some form of clawback from the funder, and quite often the funder may be a public service, for instance, will have the legal entitlement to pull back some of the funding that was allocated to your organization. They also require, typically, much more due diligence and monitoring and evaluation and control. It's not to say that grants don't require that, but it's just a more kind of precise form of it happening under contracts. Finally, under trading service, I suspect that that's maybe where most of you are considering your activities. That's where really you're out in an open market, where basically it's the consumer who decides whether or not your product or your service is worth it. And that can come in different formats. So for instance, you may be offering membership, you may be offering consultancy, you may be offering training, or indeed direct sales. That brings you very close to the consumer, and therefore there's an argument that you will be better positioned to understand what your market needs and what will sell and what will help to address those local needs. In addition then, I've got a fifth source of finance here on the income, and that's the blue, what's blue here, maybe it's purple on your screen, box called debt and finance. Now this is a slightly different form of income because usually it's got to be repaid. So it helps you achieve things, but it may not necessarily be for the direct benefit of the consumers, but it helps you to enable your activity, but ultimately you may have to repay it. And so that can come in different forms. For instance, you may actually use some of your own funding or from family and friends. You may apply for loans, and I've given a couple of examples there. Increasingly in this market, social finance is growing. So organizations are invited to apply for different forms of funding to help them basically to make a leap change in their activities, to allow them to scale or to become bigger. Now typically debt and finance solutions only come once your trading organisation is well established. It's not really an early stage proposition because the risks are too high to the funders. But anyway, hopefully that gives you a range of the understanding of the difference then across the spectrum from gift through to trading service. So I'd like you just to spend a couple of minutes again just thinking about what the pros and cons of each element of that income spectrum might be. Not just for you, but in general. So what might be the benefits, what might be some of the disadvantages of each of those in terms of what your social enterprise might be seeking to achieve? The next slide, we're just going to highlight a number of them. What I've done is I've used certain criteria and then I've mapped against each of the funding types just to give you a sense of where the relative strengths and weaknesses might be. So, on the left-hand side, in the left-hand column, I've set out a range of features that you might want to consider in relation to income. Across the top, at the head of each column then, I've placed the things that we've just talked about. So the giving, the donor, the grant, which is the funder, the commissioned, which is the contract, and then the traded income, and then finally the debt and equity issues. Although, as I say, that's usually reserved for those organisations that are well established and looking to kind of get to the next stage of growth for their organisation. So down the left-hand side, let's kind of just think of these briefly in turn. Which of these sort of best help you to keep ownership and control? Generally speaking, the income spectrum allows you to do that. Apart from maybe when you get into the debt and equity, where maybe you have to bring in an investor who will then own part of the organisation or some of its assets. But generally speaking, the main funding types, giving, grant, commissioned and traded, basically let you keep ownership and control of the organisation that you're running. In relation to flexibility on spend, the second criteria, there's where you find that the grants and commissioned tend to be less flexible. So in your proposals that go forward to either grant or commissioned or for contract, you have to specify ahead of time how you're going to spend that money. That's not so much the case if you're looking at giving or traded cycles, because you can kind of decide on, do you need that funding for staff costs, or do you need it for project activity, or do you need it for travel expenses? And so there's more flexibility. Now, of course, this isn't the case for everything, but it's just the general kind of case. In relation to agenda and priorities, well, in the case of grant and commission work, you're basically having to respond to preset agendas of either the funder or the contractor. They have identified the problem, they have identified a need, and they're asking you to fill it. Now, you may not agree with their need identification, but that's what you have to work to and respond to. In a sense, traded also has to respond to the customer's agenda and to your market's agenda. So I suppose you could almost say that's a bit of a cross between a cross and a tick. Whereas generally speaking with giving, you can, it's almost like unrestricted income as we talk about. So under grant and commissioned, it's restricted in terms of the income, in terms of you're restricted in terms of what you can do with it, whereas much more under giving, and indeed under debt equity, then you can specify how you want to spend that money. Now, in relation to availability, typically, if you're looking at giving cycles of money, it takes a lot longer than you might suspect, because it can take a while to build relationships, it can take a while to get activities up off the ground. So you have to invest in relationships really in giving, and so therefore it's not immediate, it's not quick. Equally with grants, typically it can take up to 9 months to get a response to an application if you submit it to a trust or a foundation. So it's not quick, it's not a quick turnaround. Equally with commissions, the whole process of commissioning can take a number of months. Obviously it varies a lot depending on the contractors. But once again, these are not immediate. Whereas with traded, you might argue the market decides pretty quickly whether or not it wants it, and so therefore there is quick availability. And similarly with debt and finance, social finance, they can decide pretty quickly. In relation to competition, you're always going to have competition, unless you're maybe in the social finance, but even then you can have competition there. So I think what we're saying is basically it's an increasingly competitive world. With applications and monitoring, you're certainly going to have that with grants and sort of tenders and for commissioned work. And generally speaking, the feedback cycle from each of these is pretty good. So you know pretty quick, well, you do get sort of more detailed feedback, for instance, from from most grant funders. So if you don't secure the funding, if you aren't successful, they will sort of give you an indication of why not. And that quite often is very useful feedback, because then you can use it in going forward. Also, that relates to cost of advice. So quite often the advice will be free, so you can ring up somebody beforehand and sort of talk through your ideas, your proposal, or whatever else it might be. Now, under contracted work, sometimes you're not allowed to do that. It has to be a closed tender, so your actual kind of pricing and whatnot has to remain confidential. But you may be able to talk to the project officer or whoever it might be running it beforehand, the commissioning manager, to get a sense of really what it is they're looking for. In terms of risks to your asset or to your organisation, it's really in debt and equity, social finance, that becomes a real pertinent issue. To some extent, there's a movement within commissioned work called a payment by results. Now that can pose significant risks, particularly to smaller organisations, where basically it might impact negatively on your cash flow if, in a sense, you're only going to get paid once the funder or once a commissioned organisation is happy with the impact of your work and can see the results happening. And therefore that's a movement that is sort of on the increase, and you need to kind of assess carefully whether or not your organisation can take that on board. Finally, there's also this issue about payment back. So if you fail to deliver, can they pull back money? Actually, I've put an X under commission, but actually technically they can. Also with traded, so if your customers aren't happy, they can come back and ask for a refund. And similarly, if you've mortgaged or got a mortgage or social finance on a property, they will be looking for your repayment schedules for that. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the different options around each of these cycles of activity. So think about your own social enterprise. What differentiates it? Is there anything new that you're thinking about? Actually, that might be something I want to think about, because what we're now going to do is to encourage you to reflect upon your own plan as we move into looking into each of these sort of main cycles of activity. So I'll do this quite quickly. So gifts and donations. Here's a range of things. Some of them you may recognise immediately, some of them you might not. You go, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. But quite often, under fundraising, community fundraising can be quite useful. And particularly if you're having a positive impact in your community, there's different ways of pulling together volunteers and of other forms of partnerships to encourage additional support and additional community fundraising. And similarly, that links through into events and sponsorship. So particularly for early stage activities, it's quite good to get others involved, to become advocates for your activity, to ensure that you're getting the press, the publicity, the reach into the community that you need. Equally, there's activities such as friends groups and partnerships, where you might be able to promote your activities through the advocacy of others. You might even want to think about a membership option. Does your organisation lend itself to having additional members? Would they pay a minor subscription for whatever it might be? And you have to think then about the benefits. So what comes back to people from engaging in this type of activity? It may be a newsletter, it may be keeping them informed, it may be events and activities, it may be part of the service that you offer. So don't think just about your immediate consumers, but think about those other people that surround them. Are there any activities here that might apply to them? So for instance, might there be any major donors? in your neighbourhood, or that are interested in the well-being of people in the neighbourhood or the community that you work in. Equally, something that's really sort of taking off is, crowdfunding and campaigning, where you have a cause, and we'll be talking about this a little bit later, where you can promote it and encourage others then to come along and support it financially and in kind. So hopefully you get a range across that, that there's actually quite a variety of gifts and donation possibilities out there. Obviously some of the major charities use something like payroll giving, where they approach organisations, particularly large corporates, and say, can we add our organisation to the list of sort of approved charities that you might support? So I'm not saying that all of these will be relevant to you, but there may be some things that you want to think about and how they operate. So the key thing about fundraising is what's called the prospects. So identify who's out there, who can help you. And then you have to, having identified them, listen to them. And I know this sounds like a terrible sort of word, but cultivate. Really get to know them, understand where they're coming from, understand their needs, their aspirations, and then how your organisation helps to achieve some of that. And then the next stage is when you've built up a relationship, and I think that's a very strong, dominant theme of this type of activity, is that you have to develop relationships. So you have to be willing to invest the time to nurture and to promote those relationships. And then when you feel confident enough, then you can do what's called the ask. And that's basically where you might request some funding to help you achieve a project, or some startup money, or whatever else it might be. But the key thing is about the stewardship of that. You've got to make sure that you keep people involved, that you keep them motivated, that you keep them on message, and that they then in turn become advocates. Because really what you're wanting to do is to get repeat business, so that they just don't give the once, but that they like to come back and give again, because they can see the results of their funding. So the next category was the grants. And basically grants, you have to use an application form to get them. And in this cycle of activity here, at the top you see identify opportunity. Now I shall be giving you some resources later on that help you identify, well, where would I go for a grant? Who has them? Who offers them? And the very first thing that you should do once you identify a potential opportunity is read the eligibility criteria. And please do spend time looking at that carefully to make sure that you're eligible to apply. I've seen a number of cases where people have put together wonderful proposals, they've submitted them, but because they haven't been the right kind of structure or organisation, they haven't been eligible. So please do read carefully the eligibility criteria, and once you're satisfied that you suit this organisation that you're applying to, then you can get involved in proposal preparation. Now, some organisations use a staged process, so there's like a round 1, and then if you're successful they invite you to round 2. Some of them just go straight for a full proposal. Now what that will usually require is a detailed project description. Within that you have to state the potential benefits of the work in terms of, if I do X, then Y will result. So as well as developing your case for support, you typically need to have a work plan and costings. So basically you're going to have to tell the funder, how is it that I'm going to achieve these outcomes, and how much is it going to cost me? Now once again, the eligibility criteria and the guidance that they will offer will give you some idea about what costs you can request. So for instance, in many cases you can ask for staff costs to help support the program of activity that you're proposing. In other cases you may not be able to ask for overheads in terms of the general running and infrastructure that you require for your organisation. So once again, be very, very careful and read things carefully, clearly. Part of what a funder will look at is your management and experience to date. And so quite often, particularly for new organisations, a key way of developing credibility in this space is to actually do things in partnership with others. So please do think about what partnering opportunities might you have with other organisations if they are applying for a grant. Because if you haven't got a track record yourself, you might represent a risk. If you've never managed a grant before, you might represent a risk. And so therefore it is worthwhile finding out, who would complement the kind of work I'm doing, and would they together be interested in submitting something. So quite often your business plan for your proposal will include evaluation, because the funder will want to know what's going to be achieved and how will you demonstrate that you've got there. Contracts, as I said earlier, are legal documents in the sense of that they are contractually drawn up and involve a much tighter, rigorous process, as you can see from the diagram in front of you. So initially, if we start at the top, you will express your interest, and that usually goes to what's called a PQQ stage. PQQ stands for Pre-Qualification Questionnaire, and basically in the Pre-Qualification Questionnaire, the commissioning contractors will decide whether or not they wish to invite your organisation to the next stage. If they do, if they feel confident in your organisational capability, then you will be issued the invitation to tender. And then the tender documents flow down. If you submit your tender and that's evaluated, it'll be scored and weighted according to different criteria. You may indeed be invited to a clarification interview. And then ultimately the contract will be awarded, and then for those who are unsuccessful, then also feedback will be given to them. This is a long process, and it's also quite a complex and difficult process. It's not to put people off, because obviously it represents a key form of income for a lot of social enterprises, particularly nowadays with the shrinking of public services and the increase of opportunities for the voluntary and community sector and social enterprise to sort of move into this space. So just a few things to bear in mind. Pre-qualification stage, why do they have it? Well, basically it's to check for compliance, to see whether or not you've got the right insurances and status in place. Also to find out if you're a safe and appropriate bidder, to find out about your track record and past performance, and for them to address any risks. Once you get to the tender stage, it's then about you offering up your product or service and also indicating what your future performance will be like. Now, as I've said, there is a growth within sort of moving things out from public service. So there's a localism trend that we see. And so, for instance, I've referred to here the Department of Health, Social Enterprise Innovation Fund and Future Builders. And so there are a number of schemes that are out there currently that allow you to apply into this pot. And quite often, as we'll be talking about a little bit later, a lot of councils, for instance, are outsourcing their activities this way. So it's very much done from a needs assessment stage. So the council or the authority will look at what's happening from an audit perspective in their communities. They will look to design services. They will also look to have quite often user involvement. So the actual users of those services ought to be involved. And part of what they're trying to do is to reduce risk and also the financial pressures and objectives to make sure that they're adhered to and to ensure that all legal aspects are undertaken. So once again, this process is in place to protect you as much as the commissioning managers. So trading services, this is the bread and butter probably for most of you. It's where you turn products and services into income. Now, I'm not going to expand a lot on business planning here, but basically you've got to ask yourself who will buy your products and services and what are the opportunities and challenges there. So where to find it? I'm just going to skip over the next few slides. They will be circulated afterwards, but basically where would you find out if you wanted to apply for a contract, or where would you find out if you wanted to apply for a trust grant? Well, here they are. So as I say, there's quite a lot here. There's a set of slides. Don't worry about trying to jot it all down now. A number of these resources are free. Once again, my apologies, a number of them linked to the sort of the West Midlands examples, but it's easy, just Google them for your own local area. and you'll find that they are very comprehensive. Even the free ones are very comprehensive, so don't worry about some of the ones that request funding. I think that's only for large-scale organizations. So hopefully that will give you a sense of the range of things out there. There's plenty of opportunity to go and find out further information if you think, oh, actually, I'm very interested in that particular area, or I'd be curious to find out more. So, how to get there? I think key steps to remember: decide the right type of income for your social enterprise needs. Examine the options available. Then make the application, the request, or the pitch, or whatever else it might be. Throughout it all, maintain the know-how and contact, because that's really key. Because particularly with contracts, for instance, once you're in the delivery cycle, then you tend to kind of find out about other things that will be happening, and it tends to kind of grow from there. And always, always, please assess the outcomes of your work. Now, typically, grant-based income will be used for either early-stage startup or for particular activities, maybe sort of such as research or possibly bits of innovation. But your main income is probably going to be in the form of traded and potentially into the sort of commissioned area. But once again, don't forget those small opportunities to create goodwill through grant or through charitable and other forms of fundraising and donation. I've just listed then towards the end of this now just some tips that I find very helpful. Before you begin, start early, please. The earlier you start, the better you'll be. Don't leave it to the last minute. Don't wait until the deadline if you're applying for some money. Help is out there, even from the funders. Do talk to people. Talk to those that are offering the money of whatever type it might be, because you'll be happily surprised, I'm sure, that they're very keen for you to be successful. So therefore it's in their interest not to waste their time, and therefore for you to put in the best proposal or the best tender possible. Be sensible and serious about whether or not you actually have the skills to deliver what it is that you're going to make the request for. And if you haven't got the skills, can you get them? So think very carefully about collaboration, and once again, partnership building, I think, is a key way for a lot of organizations to develop. Think about the capacity and the resource to deliver at time and at the right price. And please don't underestimate how much time it will take to do delivery. There's a tendency to sort of say, oh well, we'll cut our prices back and make ourselves look very competitive. But then if you're successful, then you find that actually you can't deliver at the rate that you said. So don't make yourself vulnerable or your organization vulnerable. Always address what is required. Remember, if you're applying for any form of funding, you're not selling, but they're buying. And therefore it's a buyer's market, and therefore they're going to judge you quite harshly against the other applicants. Always, always, always demonstrate benefits and impact, and ask yourself, if not you, sorry, why you but not another? So really identify your unique selling proposition. What is it about your organization that will achieve these outcomes that the other ones can't? Always be careful of your deadline, and indeed don't wait to the deadline to submit something. I'd advise you to get it in before the deadline. Quite often what happens is that portals or receipt areas can get bunged up, and therefore your application might not get through before the deadline. Technical failure quite often happens, so please don't wait to the deadline. And then ask yourself, does this actually fit in with my organization's reputation, with my social enterprise, with what I want to achieve? Because it may be that it doesn't, and sometimes you have to walk away from opportunities if they're not the right opportunities for you. Some more tips. During the process, do ask appropriate questions if needed. And as I've said earlier, please read the funders, whatever type of funder it might be, their guidelines. If there's an application or a form to fill in, a tender document, always check to see what their evaluation criteria is. For instance, there's not much point in you spending a lot of time crafting a beautiful response to Section A if it only carries a minor number of marks. Whereas if Section D carries 50% of the marks, you want to make sure that you hit as much as you can for Section D. Always, always, always follow the schemas that's in an application form. Don't make it up on your own, and follow completely to the letter what it is that they want. Also try to make the reader take notice. So always have a compelling opening summary. Make sure that they understand that you're going to go the extra step, add innovation and value where you can. And always explain why you. Don't assume that they know about you and your track record. They probably won't. So you have to explain. The onus is on you to do that. Also check whether or not there's any approvals or signatures required. Sometimes they might actually request it to be done in a certain colour of ink. Also check on referees and whether or not they require a specific delivery format. So for instance, some contractor commissioning managers will request things in digital format, others will require postal format, and yet others will require both formats. So just be careful and pay attention to that. If you're kind of doing any kind of written application, always proofread and check accuracy. Always consider, and even if you can get somebody else to help, that will really help, because it's quite often that you'll miss little things. And always check whether or not you have responded in full. Just as a matter of good record keeping, always keep the final version that you've sent, and keep it together along with the date and the names of the people that you may have been in contact with. Because not only can you build up a library of examples, but say for instance you're invited to a contract interview, you'll know which version of the document you submitted. I know that might seem like a silly thing to say, but I've been in many instances where, not me personally, but where there's a bit of confusion as to which was the final version that was submitted, and was it this set of figures or was it that set of figures that we've got to respond to. How to prove that you've got there. Having done all this wonderful work in terms of income generating, it's important that you know how you plan to measure impact. Now, I know that other Unlimited seminar or webinars have dealt with the issue of proving and improving impact, but please do bear in mind how you're planning to measure impact, because this is vital in terms of the monitoring, the evaluating and the accountability to stakeholders, both internal and external to your organisation. So although I'm not going to be talking about that now, I just ask you to bear that in mind. Always think about how will I know that I've got there. So that was just a quick fly through some of the background to the types of funding that's out there. As I said, there's some resources in here that you'll hopefully be able to access afterwards, and I hope that you found that interesting, and I hope it's been a little bit thought-provoking for you in relation to your own individual case. So I'm going to hand back to Marika, and perhaps if there's any questions in the chat facility, we can pick up on those. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. A lot of food for thought, even for just from my own perspective when we think about our work here at Unlimited, because we are obviously a charity as well, and have a few different income streams and ways to do that, and also individual teams have their own ways of generating income. So all really useful. I was really pleased you mentioned the impact measurement at the end. You're right, we have run a webinar on that topic, and if people are interested, I can include a copy of that when we send the information about this webinar. Because I suppose, and you're probably better placed to comment on this, Caroline, but I suppose it's often, yes, you need to think about how you know how you got there with regards to this particular funding, but also at the stage of applying for funding, a number of funders, they do require evidence. So for you to have done some of that work, ideally, unless it's your absolute first time, in which case you don't have evidence, but if you are in any position to give any sort of evidence of your impact at the time of applying, then that obviously increases your chances of getting the funding. And I have a couple of questions. One of them is mine. Hopefully that's okay. But I start with the one that's not. If you get a no from a funder, so if they turn you down, what's the sort of protocol? Are you able to go back and ask for feedback, and also are you able to then reapply?
Okay. Am I speaking? Yeah, you can hear me? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if I just kind of pop back so that we can just remind ourselves of this. It really does come down to the individual funders, and I'm sorry that's not a very useful kind of comment on it at this point. But generally speaking, funders will usually give you feedback, even if it's a commissioned contract that you've applied for. They're usually happy to share with you where they felt there maybe were weaknesses in your application or where there were strengths, but also then as to why the selected one was successful, if that makes sense. Now, some organisations, because they're quite small, can't afford this kind of investment in terms of time and resource. So they may just come back with you, you know, we are sorry, we've received a high volume of applications, and unfortunately in this instance you've not been successful. Unfortunately, given the size that we are, we're not able to kind of comment individually. But if it doesn't say that, then I think it's quite appropriate then to contact the funder and to ask for feedback and guidance. Because remember, the better quality applications they receive, the more fruitful their job is, in a sense, because they don't want to see poor quality applications. They want to see great quality applications coming through. So therefore they are willing to spend that little bit of time and extra effort with you to get you to that point where you understand better about how to improve what it is that you've done. Also, it's worthwhile sharing your applications with others that you trust, and sort of say, well, what do you think of that? And of course this is quite good to do ahead of the submission rather than sort of subsequently, to get feedback. And if you have good relationships with other organisations who have been successful, even ask, if you've got a good relationship with them, I see that you've got funding from wherever it might be, the National Lottery. I'd be very interested in seeing, would you let me see your application so I can understand, what the difference is. So that's why it's important to build up a library of examples. And quite often what you find is, and this is a handy little hint, when there's been a new program announced and then the new applicants, the successful applicants have been awarded, quite often what you'll find is that the funder will post up information about their new awards, saying about, we have, granted the following amount of money to the following people. And reading it, you can actually find out a lot about what that organisation is offering, and it's quite likely that that was lifted from their application.
Yeah.
So it's a way of trying to kind of work out what was successful compared to maybe why you weren't successful. Now, in some cases, and this unfortunately is happening increasingly, if you have failed in your application to an organisation, and this happens with a lot of charitable trusts, once again on the eligibility criteria, it will say whether or not you're allowed to reapply. So quite often they will say that you have to wait at least, a year, 2 years, 3 years even, before you can reapply. So once again, it's really important that you read the terms and conditions and the eligibility criteria and the guidance that they offer, because it may be that they would welcome a reapplication, but only after a certain delay of time, or only after you've done some substantial revision to an area, and they may indicate which areas that they want addressing. So just because they say no to you once doesn't mean that you go away and you never apply to them again. It's certainly worthwhile pursuing that.
Brilliant.
So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure that does. Thank you. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. The other question I wanted to ask, and hopefully this is something that will be relevant to everyone else on the call as well. You talked about those different stages of, identifying your funders and then or your prospects, and then there was the term cultivate.
Yes.
Which was sort of another word for getting to know your funder or your prospect and building a relationship with them. Now, this is probably a really unfair question because, again, it will really vary from funder to funder. But how would you start to know them? I mean, the obvious thing is to look on the website and read the the tender and all of that. But how would you get to a more personal contact with your,
right,
your
okay.
prospect.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that relates very much to the sort of the gift cycle, sort of that kind of language about a prospect.
Yeah.
But equally, it's appropriate to kind of get to know a program manager, for instance,
Yeah.
or a project officer. And it's really about trying to align interests, and perhaps that's the best way of thinking about it. So for instance, if you're doing great work in your community, it's showing demonstrable impact, it's improving whatever it might be, health, well-being, educational outcomes, whatever else it is. One of the tips that you can think about is, in relation to building that relationship, is to not kind of bombard funders with it, but just to kind of bring it to their attention. Sort of saying, you know, I notice in your recent, you know, I don't know, policy announcements or in your program announcements that you're interested in X, Y, and Z. Well, for instance, we've been doing the following in this area, achieving the following. And so therefore, it's a way of kind of just building up rapport and building up relationships. The other kind of really good way of doing this is through social media. So quite often, if you follow somebody, they might follow you in return. So if you use Twitter, for instance, that's a great way of building up a presence outside your immediate sort of vicinity, outside your immediate kind of locality, and getting other people to talk about it on your behalf. And then that kind of brings it to the attention of the funders, and therefore if you link up with them, for instance on Twitter or Facebook, then they're more likely to kind of want to follow you in return and to see what exactly you're up to. Because remember, for most funders and organizations of this type, they want to support innovation, they want to know what's going on, they want to sort of be at the cutting edge and be excited by what's happening in communities.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm sure on just on that topic alone we could
yes.
another hour on how do you, because then also of course then there's the local authority side, and when you go into that tendering process, then how do you get to know the people you need to know? But
well, this is the other thing. It goes back to the donor of the gift cycle, and it's really to think about events and and activities that you might be having, that might be running, that you might be helping to run. Who are you inviting to those to those activities? Are you getting the decision makers and the resource holders to those events? It's worthwhile then kind of, and once again, please don't bombard people because that will put them off. But if you do select invitations, if you're quite novel in how you go about making those invitations, then they're more likely to sit up and take notice. And that's why it's important, I think, to think across the range of activities that you might be involved in as a way of, well, how do I get the press and publicity there? How do I get people interested in what's going on? Because, people attract more people, a crowd attracts a crowd. And so if you get people interested and engaged, then more people are wanting to find out what you're doing. So certainly the use of social media and events and sort of, marketing, the strong marketing tools.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm just looking at my watch, and it is 1 minute or on the clock, 1 o'clock. So we said we would finish at 1. So let's stick to that. But I just obviously want to say a really big thank you to you, Caroline, for taking this time to obviously prepare for this, but also to join us for this live webinar. We have recorded this, and I'll be sharing this with both the participants on the call, but also other people. I know I kept getting a couple of emails throughout saying that there are people who weren't able to somehow, for the technical issues, they weren't able to register, they weren't able to get online. So we'll make sure that people will get the details. As for all the participants, this webinar, as I said in the beginning, is part of a series of webinars. And we've got a number of others coming along. So I will send you all the details for the up and coming webinars between now and December. So do join us again if there are topics that feel relevant for you. A couple of ones that we've got coming up are legal structures made simple. Again, links, strong links to fundraising and how you generate finance. We've got an introduction to branding later in the autumn, pitching, presenting, those kinds of things. So do join us. I think that's all from me. Do you want to say final words, Caroline, and then we will close the webinar?
Well, thank you for listening. I hope it's been of value and of use to you. I think, do think carefully about your future developments and the opportunities there, and don't be dismissive of some things that you initially thought, oh, actually, that sounds like too much effort, or I don't think it'll bring the rewards. Do give it a little bit of thought. And just to back up Marika's point, really do think about impact, because that underlines your credibility and also really focuses the nature of the work that you want to do. And if you're more confident in that space, then funders and consumers will be more confident in that space too. So the very best of wishes for all your endeavours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you again, and everyone have a lovely day. I don't know whereabouts you are, but in London is amazingly sunny and hot and beautiful. So do enjoy.
Indeed.
And hopefully we'll see you online again. Bye now.
Bye.